In 1942, a brilliant Japanese physicist disappeared after independently discovering the mathematics that would create the atomic bomb. Her name erased from history and replaced with a chilling code name, Subject Orchid. 50 years later, a researcher stumbles upon a single photograph that will unravel a conspiracy of silence, revealing a mother's impossible sacrifice and a truth the government buried for half a century. Dr. Catherine Chen's hands trembled as she opened the yellowed file folder in the Los Alamos archive room. It was September 1992, 50 years after the height of World War II, and she had stumbled onto something that made no sense. The photograph inside showed a young Japanese woman in a white lab coat, standing in front of what appeared to be a physics laboratory. Someone had drawn a thick black line across her face, obscuring her identity. Below the image, a typewritten label read, Subject Orchid, Priority Asset, Status, Terminated 1942. Catherine had spent 3 years researching the Manhattan Project's security protocols. She thought she knew every codename, every asset, every security concern from that era. But Subject Orchid was entirely new to her. What made it stranger was the timing. In 1942, Japan was America's enemy. The idea that a Japanese woman would have access to sensitive physics research seemed impossible. Yet here was proof that such a person existed. Catherine examined the photograph more closely. Despite the redaction across the woman's face, she could see intelligence in her posture, confidence in the way she held herself. This wasn't a secretary or assistant, this was a scientist. In the corner of the photograph, partially visible, was a badge. Catherine pulled out her magnifying glass and squinted at the tiny text. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a Berkeley Physics Department identification badge. She began photographing the file with her phone, working quickly, before anyone could stop her. The documents were sparse, just a few pages of heavily redacted text, but certain phrases stood out. Advanced theoretical knowledge, weapons implications, immediate security risk. The final page contained a single sentence that sent chills down Catherine's spine. Subject refused cooperation and has been permanently relocated for national security purposes. Catherine's supervisor, Dr. Robert Chen, no relation, entered the archive room. His expression changed the moment he saw what she was holding. Without a word, he took the file from her hands and closed it. "You shouldn't have opened that," he said quietly. "Some files stay classified for good reasons." "But who was she?" Catherine asked. "Why would a Japanese woman have access to nuclear research before the war?" Dr. Chen's face was unreadable. "Reseal the file, Catherine. This isn't your concern." But it was her concern now. That night, lying awake in her apartment, Catherine couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the photograph. Someone had erased her from history. Someone had marked her as terminated. Catherine made a decision. She would find out who Subject Orchid really was, and what had happened to her in 1942. Catherine's flight to Berkeley landed on a gray October morning. She had taken personal leave from Los Alamos, telling no one her real destination. The university archives were housed in a beautiful old building that smelled of paper and history. She presented her research credentials to the archivist, a thin woman named Dorothy, who had worked there for 30 years. Catherine explained she was researching the physics department during the early 1940s, particularly foreign students and researchers. Dorothy brought out box after box of records, class rosters, faculty minutes, research grant applications. Catherine worked through them methodically, looking for any Japanese names from that period. She found it 3 hours into her search, a doctoral dissertation abstract from 1941, author listed as Dr. Yuki Nakamura. The title made Catherine's pulse quicken. Theoretical calculations of uranium fission chain reactions and energy release potential. This was weapons research, pure and simple. And it predated the Manhattan Project's official start by more than a year. Catherine requested Nakamura's complete file. Dorothy disappeared into the stacks and returned 20 minutes later looking troubled. "The dissertation itself is missing," she said. "The card catalog shows it should be here, but the physical document is gone." "When was it last checked out?" Catherine asked. Dorothy consulted her records. "Never. According to this, it was never checked out. It simply vanished sometime after 1942. Catherine felt the familiar tingle of a cover-up. "Can you find any other records about Nakamura? Photographs, correspondence, anything?" Dorothy returned with a group photograph from 1940. Catherine's breath caught. There, standing in the second row, was a young Japanese woman. She was surrounded by men whose faces Catherine recognized from history books. Robert Oppenheimer, Edward Teller, Ernest Lawrence. The woman was small, barely 5 feet tall, with sharp eyes and a slight smile. She looked completely at ease among the giants of American physics. On the back of the photograph, someone had written names in pencil. Catherine found Nakamura's, Dr. Yuki Nakamura, doctoral candidate, theoretical physics. Catherine photographed everything, then asked Dorothy one more question. Do you have any personnel records? Anything about what happened to her after Pearl Harbor? Dorothy searched for another hour but found nothing. It's as if she was erased, Dorothy said quietly. After February 1942, there's no record she ever existed. Catherine thanked her and left the archives. Walking across the Berkeley campus, she imagined Yuki Nakamura walking these same paths 50 years earlier. A brilliant scientist working on the most dangerous knowledge humanity had ever pursued. And then, suddenly, gone, erased, terminated. Catherine knew she was onto something bigger than she had imagined. The package arrived at Catherine's hotel room that evening, slipped under her door while she was out. There was no return address, no note explaining who had sent it. Inside was a newspaper clipping from the San Francisco Chronicle, dated February 23, 1942. The headline read, "Tragic Laboratory Accident Claims Life of Research Assistant." The article was brief. An unnamed foreign research assistant had died in a fire at a university laboratory. No details about the cause, no name given. Just a tragic accident, quickly forgotten in the chaos of wartime America. But attached to the clipping was a handwritten note on plain white paper. She didn't die in any accident. Ask about Project Nightshade. Some secrets are buried for good reasons. Catherine read the note 3 times, her mind racing. Project Nightshade. She had never heard that name in all her research on wartime intelligence operations. Someone knocked on her door. Catherine froze, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she was. She approached the door slowly and looked through the peephole. An elderly Japanese-American man stood in the hallway. He was thin, probably in his 70s, wearing a neat suit and holding a worn briefcase. "Dr. Chen," he called softly. "My name is James Takeda. I believe we're looking for the same person." Catherine opened the door but kept the chain lock engaged. "How do you know who I am?" "I've been watching the Berkeley archives for 50 years, he said, waiting for someone to finally ask questions about my aunt, about Yuki Nakamura. Catherine's heart pounded. "Your aunt?" James nodded. "May I come in? I have information you need to see. Information I've been waiting 5 decades to share with someone who might actually care about the truth." Catherine studied his face. He looked tired, worn down by years of searching. But his eyes were sharp, intelligent. She saw something of Yuki Nakamura in those eyes. She opened the door. James entered and carefully set his briefcase on the small hotel desk. "Thank you for trusting me," he said. "I know this must seem strange." "Tell me about your aunt," Catherine said. James opened the briefcase and pulled out a bundle of letters tied with string. "Yuki was my mother's younger sister. Brilliant, determined, fearless. She came to America in 1936 to study physics. By 1940, she was already more advanced than most of her professors. What happened to her?" James's expression darkened. In February 1942, she was taken by military intelligence for questioning about her research. My family received a death certificate 2 weeks later. But we never received her body. No funeral, no closure, just a piece of paper saying she died in a laboratory accident. "You think she was murdered," Catherine said. "I think she was disappeared," James replied. "And I think these letters will show you why." James spread the letters across the hotel desk with the careful reverence of someone handling sacred objects. "These are the last communications my mother received from Yuki," he said. "Read them carefully." Catherine picked up the first letter, dated November 1940. The handwriting was precise, elegant. Yuki described her research in cautious terms, clearly aware that wartime censors might read her mail. But between the lines, Catherine could see the excitement of scientific discovery. Yuki had been working on calculations that would later become central to the atomic bomb, but she had gotten there independently, driven by pure scientific curiosity. The second letter, from December 1940, was more troubled. Yuki mentioned being approached by someone she called the Colonel. "He's very interested in my work," she wrote. "But not in the way a fellow scientist would be. He asks questions. About applications, about yields, about destruction potential. It makes me uncomfortable." Catherine looked up at James. "Did she say who this Colonel was?" "No name, just the Colonel. But Yuki was frightened of him, I could tell." The letters continued through 1941, charting Yuki's growing unease with the militarization of physics research. After Pearl Harbor, the tone changed completely. Yuki wrote about suspicion from colleagues, about being followed, about having her laboratory access restricted. The final letter was dated January 15, 1942. Catherine read it aloud. Dear sister, if something happens to me, know that I've hidden my complete calculations. The Colonel wants them, but I cannot give him the power to kill millions. Only someone who understands what I've hidden will find them. The mathematics are safe. I am not. Catherine felt cold. She was working on weapons calculations before the Manhattan Project even officially began. James nodded, and she realized what her work could be used for. Yuki wasn't naive. She understood that her theoretical calculations could enable the most destructive weapon ever created, so she hid them, Catherine said. She hid them somewhere even the Colonel couldn't find them. And then, 5 weeks after this letter, she vanished. Catherine studied the letters again. Where did you get the death certificate? James pulled it from his briefcase. It was official, stamped, signed. Cause of death, burn sustained in laboratory fire. But my mother never believed it. Why not? Because 2 weeks before Yuki disappeared, she sent my mother a photograph. James handed Catherine a small, faded picture. Look at the background. Catherine examined the photo. Yuki stood in front of a building that definitely wasn't Berkeley. The architecture was different, more utilitarian. And in the distance, visible over Yuki's shoulder, were mountains that looked like New Mexico. She was already gone before she supposedly died, Catherine whispered. James met her eyes. My aunt didn't die in any accident. She was taken somewhere, hidden somewhere. And I've spent 50 years trying to find out where. Catherine spent 3 days preparing for Washington. She needed access to classified wartime intelligence files, which meant using her security clearance in ways that would definitely attract attention. She didn't care anymore. Yuki Nakamura deserved better than being erased from history. The National Archives building was massive, intimidating. Catherine showed her credentials and requested access to World War II counterintelligence operations, specifically anything related to the detention or surveillance of foreign scientists. The archivist, a serious man named Robert, led her to a secure reading room. These files are still partially classified, he warned. You can view them, but no photographs, no copies. Catherine agreed and began her search. She started with general files about Japanese-American internment, then moved to more specific intelligence operations. It took hours of tedious reading before she found the first reference. A brief mention in an Army intelligence memo from January 1942, Project Nightshade established to monitor and, if necessary, detain foreign nationals with access to sensitive research. Catherine's pulse quickened. She requested every file mentioning Project Nightshade. What came back was shocking. Project Nightshade wasn't just about Japanese Americans. It targeted any foreign-born scientist working on physics research that might have weapons applications. Germans, Italians, Russians, Chinese, anyone who wasn't a native-born American citizen. The project was run by Army intelligence, specifically by a Colonel Michael Harrison. Catherine recognized the name immediately. Harrison had later become a high-ranking CIA official, serving until his death in 1978. She found a file specifically about Yuki Nakamura. The documents inside made her hands shake. Subject Orchid, real name Yuki Nakamura, designated security risk November 1941. Subject has independently developed theoretical calculations for uranium fission weapons. Knowledge predates official weapons program and represents significant security concern. Another memo, dated February 10, 1942. Subject Orchid has refused cooperation with intelligence debriefing. Refuses to share complete calculations. Recommend immediate relocation and information extraction. Asset cannot be allowed to return to Japan with current knowledge. The memo was signed by Colonel Michael Harrison. Catherine found one more document, a transfer order dated February 20, 1942. Subject Orchid to be relocated to Site 7, New Mexico, for extended debriefing and research cooperation. Site 7. Catherine had never heard of it in any Manhattan Project history. She asked Robert the archivist about it. He searched his databases and returned looking puzzled. Site 7 appears in several 1942 documents, but there's no record of what it actually was. It's not Los Alamos, not Trinity, not any of the known Manhattan Project facilities. Can you give me its location? Catherine asked. Robert consulted the files. Jemez Mountains, New Mexico. Approximately 60 miles northwest of where Los Alamos would later be built. But there's no record of what happened there or when it closed. Catherine knew where she needed to go next. Catherine rented a 4-wheel drive vehicle in Albuquerque and called James Takeda, he took the next flight from San Francisco. They met at a small hotel in Los Alamos, spreading maps across Catherine's room. The coordinates for Site 7 put it deep in the Guémez Mountains, accessible only by rough forest roads that probably hadn't been maintained in 50 years. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Catherine asked James. "You're 73 years old. This isn't going to be an easy hike." James smiled. "I've been waiting 50 years to find out what happened to Yuki. I'm not stopping now because of some rough terrain." They set out early the next morning, following old logging roads that deteriorated into barely visible trails. The landscape was beautiful but harsh, high desert giving way to pine forest as they climbed into the mountains. After 3 hours of difficult driving, they found it. A rusted chain-link fence, half collapsed, surrounding a clearing that had once held buildings. Concrete foundations remained, along with the skeletal frames of several structures. "This is it," Catherine whispered. They parked and walked through the rusted gate. The main building's foundation was largest, probably 30 feet by 60 feet. Smaller buildings had surrounded it, connected by cracked concrete pathways. James walked slowly through the ruins, touching the remains of walls, looking at the scattered debris. "My aunt was here," he said quietly. "I can feel it." Catherine found what had once been the main laboratory building. 3 walls still stood, made of concrete and steel. The roof had long since collapsed, but the structure's bones remained. She stepped inside carefully, testing each footfall. Debris covered the floor, broken glass, rusted equipment, fragments of furniture destroyed by decades of weather. Then she saw it. On one of the concrete support beams, carved deeply into the surface. YN, March 1942. "They cannot force mathematics from an unwilling mind." "James," Catherine called. He came quickly, breathing hard from the exertion. When he saw the carving, tears filled his eyes. "That's her handwriting," he said. "I'd recognize it anywhere." Catherine photographed the carving from every angle. Yuki had been here, she had been held here, and she had been resisting whoever was trying to extract her research. They searched the rest of the site for 2 more hours. Catherine found fragments of laboratory equipment, old filing cabinets too rusted to open, and the remains of what might have been living quarters. In what had been a small office, James discovered something lodged between 2 concrete blocks. He pulled it free carefully. It was a small notebook, protected from the weather by its hiding place. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but readable. It was written in Japanese. James's hands trembled as he translated. "Day 37, at Site 7. The colonel came again today, demanding my complete calculations. I told him the same thing I tell him every day. Mathematics cannot be tortured from a mind that refuses to yield." Catherine and James returned to Santa Fe with the notebook, which contained 3 months of Yuki's observations from Site 7. That evening, following a lead from old personnel records, they tracked down Margaret Whitmore. She lived in a modest house on the outskirts of Santa Fe, surrounded by photographs of children and grandchildren. When Catherine explained who they were looking for, Margaret's face went pale. "I wondered when someone would finally come asking about that place," she said quietly. "Come in." Margaret was 94 but sharp as a blade. She had been an army nurse during the war, assigned to Site 7 from March through November 1942. "What was Site 7?" Catherine asked. Margaret poured them tea with steady hands. Officially, it was a research facility. Unofficially, it was a detention center for scientists the government considered security risks. What kind of scientists? The brilliant kind. The dangerous kind. Margaret's eyes grew distant. "We had German refugees who knew too much about rocket science. Italian physicists who'd worked with Fermi, Russian mathematicians, Chinese chemists, and Yuki Nakamura. You remember her," James said, his voice breaking. "I could never forget her." Margaret's expression softened. "She was the smallest person there physically, but she had the strongest will I'd ever encountered. The colonel tried everything to get her to cooperate." "Colonel Harrison," Catherine said. Margaret nodded. "He needed Yuki's calculations desperately. The Manhattan Project was just getting started, and they were months behind where they needed to be. Yuki had already solved problems they were still struggling with. But she wouldn't help them," James said. "She wouldn't." Margaret stood and retrieved a small box from a closet. "I kept these, even though I probably shouldn't have." She pulled out photographs, faded but clear. Catherine's breath caught. The images showed Site 7 as it had been in 1942. Neat buildings, guards at the gate, scientists walking between structures. And there, in one photograph, was Yuki Nakamura. She looked thinner than in the Berkeley photograph, tired. But her eyes still held that same fierce intelligence. For 8 months, Margaret continued, Yuki refused to give the colonel what he wanted. He offered her everything: citizenship, a position on the Manhattan Project, recognition for her work, protection for her family. What did she want? Catherine asked. Margaret's expression grew sad. She wanted the war to end without nuclear weapons being used. She understood what her calculations would enable, and she couldn't bear the thought of being responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths. But she eventually cooperated, James said. Otherwise, why would they have released her? Margaret's face showed deep pain. She did cooperate, but not for any of the reasons the colonel offered. The truth is much more complicated than that. Margaret refilled their tea, her hands steady despite the weight of the memories. By October 1942, Margaret continued, the Manhattan Project was accelerating. They needed Yuki's calculations desperately. Colonel Harrison made one final offer, but this one was different from all the others. What did he offer? Catherine asked. Margaret pulled out another photograph. This one showed Yuki, visibly pregnant, standing beside one of the Site 7 buildings. The image was dated August 1942. James made a sound of shock. She was pregnant? Margaret nodded. None of us knew who the father was. Yuki never said. But the colonel saw an opportunity. Catherine felt sick. He used her baby as leverage. Not exactly. Margaret's expression was complicated. He made her an offer that only a desperate mother could understand. If Yuki gave him her calculations, he would adopt her child. Raise the baby as his own. Give her a life free from discrimination, free from internment camps, free from being identified as the child of an enemy alien. James was crying now. She gave up her baby to protect her, and her research to protect everyone else, Margaret added. Yuki's condition was specific. Harrison would adopt the child, never tell her about her birth mother, and raise her with every advantage he could provide. In exchange, Yuki would provide her complete calculations and disappear forever. What do you mean disappear? Catherine asked. Margaret stood and walked to the window. Yuki Nakamura had to die officially. The government couldn't have a Japanese scientist walking around with knowledge of atomic weapons calculations. So they staged her death, gave her a new identity, and sent her away. Where? I don't know. Margaret turned back to them. I was transferred out of Site 7 in November 1942, right after Yuki gave birth. I never saw her again, but I saw the adoption papers. Colonel Harrison and his wife Patricia adopted a baby girl in November 1942. Do you know what happened to the child? James asked. Margaret smiled sadly. I kept track over the years. The girl was named Sarah Harrison. The colonel raised her well, encouraged her education. She became a physicist, just like her mother. Catherine's mind raced. Is she still alive? Margaret nodded. Dr. Sarah Mitchell now. She's a physics professor at MIT, married name. She's about 50 years old now. Does she know? James asked. Does she know who her real mother was? Margaret shook her head. As far as I know, she has no idea she was adopted. The colonel kept his promise to Yuki. He raised Sarah as his own daughter and never told her the truth. Catherine looked at James. We have to tell her. James wiped his eyes. My cousin. I have a cousin I never knew existed. Margaret touched his hand gently. Yuki sacrificed everything for that child. Her research, her identity, her entire future. Make sure Sarah knows that her mother loved her enough to give her away. Catherine spent 2 weeks building her case before approaching Dr. Sarah Mitchell. She needed irrefutable evidence, adoption records, DNA comparison samples from James, and careful documentation of everything they had discovered. The adoption records from Los Angeles County had been sealed, but Catherine found a sympathetic clerk who helped her access them. Baby girl born October 28, 1942, mother's name withheld, adopted by Michael and Patricia Harrison, November 15, 1942. Everything matched Margaret's story. Catherine called MIT and requested a meeting with Dr. Best. Mitchell, claiming to be researching the family histories of Manhattan Project personnel, Sarah agreed to meet, curious about her father's wartime service. Catherine and James flew to Boston in early March 1993. They met Sarah in her office at MIT, a cluttered space filled with physics textbooks and research papers. Sarah was 50 years old, attractive, with sharp features and intelligent eyes. Catherine saw Yuki Nakamura in her face immediately. The resemblance was unmistakable. Thank you for meeting with us, Catherine began carefully. This is going to be difficult to hear. Sarah smiled. My father worked in intelligence during the war. I'm used to difficult stories. Catherine glanced at James, who nodded. Dr. Mitchell, What we've discovered isn't just about your father's wartime service, it's about your family history, your personal history. Sarah's smile faded. I don't understand. Catherine opened her folder and pulled out the adoption records. According to these documents, you were adopted in November 1942. Your birth mother's identity was sealed. Sarah's face went white. That's impossible. My father never said anything about adoption. Catherine showed her the photographs of Yuki Nakamura. This woman was a physicist at Berkeley before the war. Her name was Dr. Yuki Nakamura. She was detained by military intelligence in 1942 because of her research. James leaned forward. Dr. Mitchell, Yuki Nakamura was my aunt, and we believe she was your birth mother. Sarah stood abruptly, her hands shaking. This is insane. My father would have told me. Catherine pulled out the DNA comparison results. We've already run preliminary tests using samples from Mr. Takeda. We can confirm the relationship with your cooperation, but the evidence is already very strong. Sarah stared at the calendar. Documents, the photographs, the evidence spread across her desk. Her whole life, everything she thought she knew about herself, was collapsing. Why? She whispered. Why would my father keep this secret? James's voice was gentle. Because he made a promise to your mother. A promise to protect you, to give you a life free from discrimination. A promise to raise you as his own. Sarah sat down slowly. Tell me everything. I want to know everything about her. Catherine and James spent the next 3 hours telling Yuki Nakamura's story. Sarah Mitchell didn't sleep for 2 days after learning the truth. She called in sick to her classes and sat in her apartment, staring at photographs of a woman she had never met but who looked exactly like her. Catherine had given her copies of Yuki's letters, the photographs from Berkeley and Site 7, and Margaret Whitmore's contact information. Sarah read everything twice, 3 times, trying to reconcile this hidden history with the life she had known. Her father, Colonel Michael Harrison, had died in 1978, when Sarah was 35. They had been close. He had encouraged her love of mathematics, supported her physics education, attended her doctoral defense at Caltech. Had he ever wanted to tell her the truth? Sarah found the key to her father's safe deposit box in her apartment. She had inherited it after his death, but had never opened it, assuming it contained routine financial documents. The bank manager led her to the vault. The box was small, old. Sarah's hands trembled as she unlocked it. Inside was a single envelope, sealed with wax. On the front, in her father's handwriting, to Sarah, to be opened only if you ever learn the truth about your birth. Sarah sat in the private viewing room and broke the seal. My dearest Sarah, the letter began. If you are reading this, then someone has finally uncovered the secret I have kept for your entire life. I hope you can forgive an old man who loved you too much to burden you with a truth that would only bring pain. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes and continued reading. Your birth mother was the most brilliant and courageous person I ever met. Dr. Yuki Nakamura came to my attention in 1941 because her research was years ahead of anything our own scientists had achieved. When war broke out, my job was to secure her knowledge for America. I detained her. I pressured her. I did things I am not proud of. But she never broke. She refused to let her mathematics be used for weapons, no matter what I offered her. Then I learned she was pregnant. I don't know who the father was, and she never told me. But I saw an opportunity that became something more. I offered to adopt her child, to raise you as my own. Your mother agreed, but only with strict conditions. You would never know about her. You would never know you were adopted. You would be raised as a true American, free from the discrimination she had faced. In exchange, she gave me her calculations. The mathematics that helped create the atomic bomb. Sarah, your mother sacrificed everything for you, her research, her identity, her freedom. She did it so you could have the life she never could. The letter continued for 3 more pages, describing Yuki's courage, intelligence, and love. At the end, her father had written, I have one final gift for you. The location where your mother lived after leaving Site 7. She made me promise never to contact her, never to tell you about her while she was alive. But if you are reading this, you deserve to know where she went. The address was in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a small town called Middletown, about 10 miles outside the state capital. Sarah called Catherine immediately. We need to go there. We need to find out what happened to her. They flew to Pennsylvania the next day. Sarah, Catherine, and James. They rented a car at the airport and drove to Middletown in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The address led them to a drain-today, modest house on a quiet street. The current owners, an elderly couple named the Johnsons, invited them in when Sarah explained she was researching someone who had lived there decades earlier. Grace Yamada, Mrs. Johnson said, remembering. She lived here from 1943 until she died in 1968. Lovely woman, very quiet. She taught mathematics at the local high school. Sarah's breath caught. Grace Yamada. A new identity, a new life. Did she ever marry? James asked gently. Mrs. Johnson shook her head. No, she lived alone. Very private person. But the students loved her. She had a gift for explaining complex mathematics in ways anyone could understand. Do you know where she's buried? Catherine asked. Middletown Cemetery, Mr. Johnson replied. She had a small funeral, just a few colleagues from the school. She left instructions that she wanted a simple gravestone. They found the cemetery on a hillside overlooking the town. The groundskeeper helped them locate the grave. Grace Yamada, the stone read. 1916 to 1968. She taught us to see beauty in numbers. Sarah knelt beside the grave, touching the cold stone. Mom, she whispered, I wish I had known you. James placed flowers on the grave, crying quietly. Yuki, you deserved so much better than this. Catherine photographed the gravestone, documenting the final piece of Yuki Nakamura's story. But there was one more discovery waiting. The cemetery office had a file on Grace Yamada. In it was a sealed letter, left with instructions to be given to anyone who came asking about her true identity. The envelope was addressed, to my daughter, if you ever find me. Sarah's hands shook as she opened it. The letter inside was written in English, dated December 1967, just months before Yuki's death from cancer. My darling daughter, it began. I do not know if you will ever read this. I hope you have lived a full and happy life, free from the shadows that trapped me. Your father, Colonel Harrison, promised to give you everything I could not. I pray he kept that promise. I gave you away because I loved you more than I loved my own freedom. I gave away my mathematics because I loved humanity more than I loved my own glory. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share freely, but some love is too powerful to contain. I have watched from afar, through channels I cannot explain. I know you became a physicist like me. I know you are brilliant, kind, and strong. Be free, my daughter. Be the scientist I could have been. Use your gifts for creation, not destruction. I may never hold you, but I have always loved you. Your mother, Yuki Nakamura. Sarah Mitchell used her father's connections and her own professional standing to access the final classified files about Yuki Nakamura. What she discovered filled in the remaining gaps of her mother's story. After giving birth at Site 7 and surrendering both her daughter and her research to Colonel Harrison, Yuki had been quietly released in November 1942 under a false identity. The government gave her $10,000, a new social security number under the name Grace Yamada, and a one-way train ticket to Pennsylvania. In exchange, she signed documents promising never to discuss her research, her detention, or her true identity. The files contained reports tracking her for the next 25 years. Government agents had monitored Grace Yamada periodically, ensuring she kept her silence. The reports were mundane. Subject teaches high school mathematics, lives quietly, no security concerns. But one report from 1967 caught Sarah's attention. Subject diagnosed with terminal cancer, prognosis, 6 to 12 months. Subject has made no attempt to contact daughter or reveal classified information. Recommend surveillance continue until subject's death. They had watched her die, Sarah whispered, reading the cold bureaucratic language. They watched my mother die alone, and did nothing. Catherine touched her shoulder gently. She wasn't alone in spirit. She knew you were out there, living the life she wanted for you. Sarah found one final document that broke her heart. A letter Yuki had written to Colonel Harrison in January 1968, 1 month before her death. Dear Michael, it began, using his first name, I am dying. The doctors give me weeks, perhaps days. I write not to ask for anything but to thank you for keeping your promise. I have followed Sarah's career from afar. She is everything I hoped she would be. Brilliant, accomplished, free. You gave her the life I could not. I know what my calculations enabled. I know the bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki used mathematics I developed. That weight has been mine to carry alone. But I also know that Sarah has used her gifts for peaceful research. She builds rather than destroys. That redemption is enough for me. Thank you for being the father she needed. Thank you for loving her as your own. Please, never tell her about me. Let her remember you as the hero you were to her. With gratitude, Yuki. Sarah showed the letter to James, who read it with tears streaming down his face. She forgave him, James said. After everything he did to her, she forgave him because he loved you. Sarah looked at the grave where her mother lay buried under a false name. She forgave him, but I'm not sure I can. Catherine understood. Your mother made impossible choices in an impossible time. She sacrificed everything for you and for a principle she believed in. The question is, Sarah said quietly, what do I do with this truth now? Sarah Mitchell made her decision on a bright April morning in 1993. She contacted the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, and the National Archives with a formal request to declassify her mother's story. The response was immediate and hostile. Government lawyers argued that releasing information about Project Nightshade would compromise ongoing intelligence methods. They threatened legal action if Sarah attempted to publish anything about her mother's detention. Sarah was a 50-year-old physics professor with tenure at MIT and connections throughout the scientific community. She wasn't easily intimidated. She contacted the American Civil Liberties Union, the National Association of Japanese Americans, and several investigative journalists. Within weeks, the story began to leak. Catherine Chen published a carefully vetted historical paper about Project Nightshade in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, revealing the existence of Site 7 and the detention of foreign-born scientists during the war. James Takeda gave interviews to Japanese American newspapers, describing his aunt's sacrifice and 50-year search for truth. Sarah herself wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times titled, My Mother's Secret: How America Detained the Scientist Who Could Have Changed History. The government fought back, but public opinion shifted quickly. The story of a brilliant Japanese woman who had independently developed nuclear weapons calculations before the Manhattan Project, only to be detained and erased from history, captured national attention. By June, the pressure became too great. The Department of Energy announced it would declassify most Project Nightshade files and acknowledge the wrongful detention of scientists during World War II. Sarah attended the press conference where the announcement was made. She brought photographs of Yuki, the letters, and Margaret Whitmore's testimony. When reporters asked why this mattered 50 years later, Sarah's answer was simple: because my mother deserves to be remembered for who she really was. Not as Subject Orchid, not as a security risk, but as Dr. Yuki Nakamura, a brilliant physicist who understood the moral weight of her discoveries. The declassified files revealed that 29 scientists had been detained at Site 7 between 1942 and 1944. Most were eventually released under false identities. Several had died without their families ever knowing what happened to them. Catherine and James helped establish a memorial at the Site 7 location in the Jemez Mountains. The rusted fence was removed and replaced with a simple monument listing the names of all the detained scientists. Yuki Nakamura's name was carved at the top. Sarah arranged for her mother's remains to be exhumed from the Middletown Cemetery and reburied under her true name at the memorial site. The ceremony took place on a cool October morning, exactly 51 years after Yuki had given birth to the daughter she would never hold. James Takeda, now 74, spoke about the aunt he had barely known but had never stopped fighting for. Margaret Whitmore, 95, attended in a wheelchair and shared her memories of Yuki's courage at Site 7. And Sarah Mitchell stood before her mother's new grave and finally said goodbye. The academic recognition came slowly, but it came. In 1994, the American Physical Society posthumously awarded Dr. Yuki Nakamura its highest honor for theoretical contributions to nuclear physics. Sarah accepted the award on her mother's behalf, standing before hundreds of physicists at the annual meeting. She spoke about Yuki's independent development of fission calculations and her moral courage in resisting their weaponization. The audience gave a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. Catherine Chen completed her historical research, publishing a comprehensive book about Project Nightshade and the scientists who were detained. The book, titled The Disappeared: Forgotten Scientists of the Manhattan Project Era, became required reading in physics departments across the country. James Takeda lived to see his aunt's vindication. He died peacefully in 1996 at age 76, having spent his final years sharing Yuki's story with anyone who would listen. Sarah continued teaching at MIT, but she also became an advocate for government transparency and scientific ethics. She gave lectures about her mother's story, emphasizing the dangers of sacrificing civil liberties in the name of national security. In 2003, the National Academy of Sciences established the Yuki Nakamura Fellowship for Young Women in Physics. The fellowship specifically supports research in theoretical physics and encourages ethical consideration of scientific discoveries. Sarah served on the fellowship selection committee until her retirement in 2015. Margaret Whitmore lived to be 99, passing away in 1998. Before her death, she recorded extensive oral histories about Site-7, ensuring that the stories of all the detained scientists would be preserved. The Site-7 Memorial became a place of pilgrimage for families of the detained scientists. Over the years, more names were added as researchers uncovered additional cases of wartime detention. Catherine made it her life's work to identify every scientist who had been detained and ensure their contributions were recognized. She discovered 12 more cases beyond the original 29, including 2 scientists who had died in detention under suspicious circumstances. In 2007, the U.S. government issued a formal apology for Project Nightshade and established a compensation fund for the families of detained scientists. Sarah attended the ceremony but refused the compensation money. Instead, she donated it to the Yuki Nakamura Fellowship. She kept only one thing from her mother's estate: the carved wooden beam from Site-7 with Yuki's defiant message. It hung in Sarah's MIT office until her retirement, a reminder that some principles are worth any sacrifice. And every year on October 28, her mother's birthday, Sarah visited the memorial in the Jemez Mountains and left fresh flowers on Yuki's grave. She never stopped, missing the mother she never knew. But she understood, finally, the depth of love it took to give away everything for a daughter's freedom. Yuki Nakamura's story was no longer a secret. It was a legacy,